Pastor Trish, and it is Thursday evening. And happy birthday to a couple people out there. It's a good day to have a birthday. We are on Psalm 14 this evening, and this psalm it can be classified in a variety of ways and has been. But it's probably most likely a psalm of instruction, reminding us of the foolish way and the other way. Maybe that's one of the ways to think about that. So it's really instructing us as to what foolishness looks like and knowing that the alternative is not being foolish when it comes to standing before God, before being in God's presence, before recognizing that God is the way of the world. And so I am going to read this psalm first this evening and then just give you a little bit more information or hopefully a little bit to think about. So this is Psalm 14. Fools say in their hearts, there is no God. They are corrupt and they do evil things. Not one of them does anything good. The Lord looks down from heaven on humans to see if anyone is wise, to see if anyone seeks God. But all of them have turned to bad. Everyone is corrupt. No one does good, not ever one person, not even one person. Are they dumb, all these evildoers, devouring my people like they are eating bread, but never calling on the Lord? Count on it, they will be in utter panic, because God is with the righteous generation. You evildoers may humiliate the plans of those who suffer, but the Lord is their refuge. Let Israel's salvation come out of Zion. When the Lord changes his people's circumstances for the better, Jacob will rejoice and Israel will celebrate. So this psalm talks, as you can hear, quite a bit about the evildoers and the foolish people, and we can certainly read into that God's judgment. It's important, though, that we don't read into that God's judgment on those who don't believe in God or those who are opposed to God. It is often and can be and should be interpreted that this psalmist is speaking just as much about those of us who are people of faith as people who are not of faith, that this is one of those convicting psalms for those who are people of faith as much as anything else, because we often proclaim God but don't live like we proclaim God, right? And so the questions for you to think about tonight is, how is God's presence reflected in our world today? How do you think you see the presence of God in our world? And then, how is the presence of God reflected in you? How does your life reflect God's presence, God's actions? What is it that you say and do that reflects Christ to other people? Or what are you not doing, perhaps? Um, as I said, we often want to be in control. We often think that we don't need God, and of course, that's the exact opposite. This idea of foolishness, too, isn't shouldn't be thought of as being smart or not, but think of foolishness as your actions. So again, we might think all sorts of things, believe all sorts of things, but then ultimately, what's most important are our actions. And I want to close then with a quote by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who talks a little bit about um, this understanding that we often have of godlessness as it's acted out in our everyday lives, instead of understanding that we constantly live our life before God. What he said is, God is no stopgap, but must be recognized as the center of life, not when we are at the end of our resources. It is his will to be recognized in life, and not only when death comes, in health and in vigor, and not only in suffering, in our activities, and not only in sin. We are to recognize God in the good times, in other words, and not just in our times of difficulties, and live that out. And he said, and this, of course, was way back during the time of World War II, and even then, and still, and perhaps even more so today, the modern world often makes this impossible. He said God is a working hypothesis in morals, politics, or science has been surmounted and abolished. And the same thing has happened in philosophy and religion. And we cannot be honest unless we recognize that we too have not been standing before God, not recognizing that we are always before God. He goes on and then he ends at the end talking about God's free will for us, right? Or the free will that God has given us to make those decisions, and that ultimately where we find God and see God, He's ever before us, even if we don't want to recognize that. And he ends by saying, God lets Himself be pushed out of the world onto the cross. God lets Himself be pushed out of the world onto the cross. He is weak and powerless in the world, and that is precisely the way, the only way, in which He can be with us and help us. Matthew chapter 8, verse 17 makes it quite clear that Christ helps us, not by virtue of His omnipotence, but by virtue of His weakness and His suffering. So, just some food for thought for you this evening as you contemplate this particular Psalm, Psalm 14. And again, how does your life reflect God's presence? May you have a good evening, a blessed evening, and we'll see you tomorrow.